Hello everyone, welcome to the channel Sluggers Blue for your cat VRC preparation. In this session, we'll be taking up the fourth RC of the Culture and Social Sciences genre. This RC was asked in your in the second slot of your CAT exam in the year 2020. I've titled it as The Study of Visual Culture. Number of verses 509 with 5 questions. Again, quite standard as per CAT. Now, for those of you who might be watching this session for the first time, know that the session is split into two parts. Part one, which is the passage explainer, where I take you through each and every paragraph of the passage and explain it in detail by the use of a schematic diagram. And part two is where I take you through the questions. The current video is part one. What you're watching right now is every session has two videos. This video is part one. And 40 such sessions make up a course that I've titled as an anthology of RCs for your reading comprehension preparation for the CAT. So, and those of you who have not watched the intro video and you are interested to know the details of the course, you can watch the intro video of this course by clicking on a cue card on the top right side of your screen. You should be able to see a letter I there, and if you click on that, it will show you the thumbnail of the intro video, which you can click and well, check out the details of the course. All right, so let's jump into the passage explainer now. Okay, so now guys, this is the passage explainer part of the video. Your passage explainer screen, your current screen is split into two parts. On the left side is where we'll have the passage, as you can see here. And on the right side is where we'll have the schematic diagrams. Now, the way we'll go about this is that I'll read and explain the passage paragraph by paragraph as the schematic diagram simultaneously appears on the right. Okay. Post reading every paragraph, I'll explain the same in detail by the use of the schematic diagram that will have appeared by that time, and then move on to the next paragraph. All right, so let's start with the first paragraph. Okay, now before we start going through the explanation of each and every paragraph here, I would like to note here that guys, this passage is definitely would definitely rank among the top 10 most difficult passages that are featured in the CAT exam. For the same reason, I would suggest that we pay close attention here, that you pay close attention here as we go through the explanation. Okay, so let's start. Uh, the claims advanced here may be condensed into two assertions. First, that visual culture is what images, acts of seeing, and attendant intellectual, emotional, and perceptual sensibilities do to build, maintain, and transform the worlds in which people live. Right? That's the first assertion. And second, that the study of visual culture is the analysis and interpretation of images and the ways of seeing or gazes that configure the agents, practices, conceptualities, and institutions that put images to work. Okay. So yes, the author has by using two really long and complex sentences that talk about really abstract ideas, made put forth two assertions here, right? Now, although I understand that although we have put the ideas in the schematic here, I'm going to use a third schematic to help you understand this better, to actually help you get the gist of what the author is trying to do here or say here. Okay, so please pay attention. So see, guys, first of all, I wanted to consider this very simple scenario of a person perceiving some images, right? So there are a set of images and there is an act of seeing that is being undertaken by a person, okay? And the person is obviously situated in his world. Like this region here is the world, right? This is the region of the world that the person is situated in, okay? All right. So far, so good. Let's proceed. And now, in this context, in the context of a person undertaking acts of seeing to perceive images in his own situated world. Now let's try to read what the author has said here, right? And okay, I'm going to read it again. The author says the claims advanced here may be condensed into two assertions. Very straightforward. Yes, yeah, the claims advanced here can be categorized into two main assertions, out of which the first assertion is that visual culture is what images, acts of seeing, is what images, acts of seeing, and attendant intellectual, emotional, and perceptual sensibilities, and the attendant intellectual, I for intellectual, E for emotional, and P for perceptual sensibilities of the person. So there are three factors involved here. Please pay attention. images, acts of seeing, and the attendant intellectual, emotional, and sensibilities which are attendant during this process of seeing the or perceiving the images, right? Do what these factors do. What is visual culture is what these three factors do to build, maintain, or transform the world that we live in. Okay, this BMT basically stands for build, maintain, and transform. Okay, so I'll repeat once again. The first assertion says that visual culture is nothing but what the images, the acts of seeing, and the attendant intellectual, emotional, and perceptual sensibilities, what these three factors do in order to build, maintain, and transform the world that we are situated in. Okay, so I hope at this point at least you're able to make better sense of what the first assertion is. Okay, let's come to the second one. And second, the second assertion says, second, that the study of visual culture. The first assertion was about what visual culture is, and the second assertion is about what the study of visual culture is, right? So he has gone one level meta here. And second that the study of visual culture is the analysis and interpretation, of images. One is images, and ways of seeing, which can also be regarded as gazes. He's probably, I think the passage has been probably taken from a very specific and a very niche genre, right? The domain. So that's why. So it has its own terms for some regular ideas. Like gazes is used for the various ways of seeing, I guess. So so he says that study of visual culture is nothing but the analysis and interpretation of images and ways of seeing, also known as gazes, which that okay, he's talking about the ways of seeing, and he's going into further description of ways of seeing and gazes here, that configure the agents practices conceptualities, the A for agents, P for practices, C for conceptualities, and I for institutions that put images to work. Okay, I'll go through it once again to simplify. Second assertion is that the study of visual culture is the analysis and interpretation of images and the various ways of seeing. That's what he means. The later part is just further information that he has provided with relating to the ways of seeing. That what ways of seeing is he talking about? He's talking about the ways of seeing which configure the agents, practices, and conceptualities and institutions that put images to work. And why have I used the BMT BMT term here? Because images being put to work is images building, maintaining, or transforming the world, right? That's what the author has said in the first assertion, that images, that visual culture is nothing but these three factors: building, maintaining, and transforming. So even images build, maintain, and transform. That's how the images work. That's how images work, by building, maintaining, and transforming the world we live in. And hence, and then that's the reason why we can put BMT here as a proxy for images to work, right? So ways of seeing or gazes that configure agents, practices, conceptualities, and institutions that put images to work. That is, that put images to work in the sense, have them build, maintain, and transform the world that we live in. That, guys, is what the author means to say in the first paragraph. Okay, now I do understand, and I totally sympathize with you that this is something that is really complex. In fact, might people you might not be wrong if you consider it beyond complex, and especially given the time constraint scenario in which you're expected to make sense of this. But 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 we'll talk about this, like how to deal with this kind of complexity in passages, and then what how to best address these is something that we'll definitely talk about in either the later part of the video, or definitely in some other sessions. Okay, for now just pay attention to the passage and try to understand it to the best you can. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph. Coming to paragraph 2. In paragraph 1, he talked about two assertions, right? First assertion was visual culture, second was study of visual culture, and from this point onwards, he continues the narrative. He says that accordingly, the study of visual culture, that means related to the second assertion, accordingly, the study of visual culture should be characterized by several concerns. Okay, first, scholars of visual culture need to examine any and all imagery, high and low, art and non-art. Okay, they must not restrict themselves to objects of a particular beauty or aesthetic value. Indeed, any kind of imagery may be found to offer up evidence of the visual construction of reality. So, uh, I think you might, we can note here that the structure of the passage from this point onwards seems like the author is trying to explain or talk about all the concerns that one might have with respect to the second assertion, with respect to the study of visual culture, and he has listed the first concern in this paragraph, where he says that the scholars of visual culture should indiscriminately examine any and all types of images irrespective of, well, types. Excuse the double repetition of types, but right, but you get the idea, you get the gist that the point is very simple, that he's saying that the scholars of visual culture who plan to study visual culture, they should not discriminate between the various types of images. Okay, they should read, they should study and examine all types of imagery, high and low, art and non-art, and, well, basically all types. So that's what he's trying to say here, and that's your second paragraph. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, now in this paragraph, the author has continued his narrative of discussing the several concerns related to the study of visual culture. The in the earlier paragraph, he talked about the first concern, and here he continues with the second concern. He says, second, the study of visual culture must scrutinize visual practice as much as images themselves. So, must scrutinize visual practice as much as images themselves, asking what images do when they are put to use. If scholars engaged in this enterprise inquire what makes an image beautiful or why this image or that constitutes a masterpiece or a work of genius, they should do so with the purpose of investigating an artist's or a work's contribution to the experience of beauty, taste, value, or genius. Right. So, again, quite an abstract idea has been discussed here. So let's try to first understand this part, the first part of this paragraph, before we move on to the next part. So, see, guys, what the author has said here with respect to the second concern with which study of visual culture is that the scholars who are studying visual culture should at least focus as much attention on visual practices as on the images themselves. Okay, in this context, so visual practices should not be ignored. In fact, they should pay at least equal attention to visual practices as they uh, pay to images themselves. And while doing that, what exactly they are supposed to figure out here is uh, they're supposed to figure out how the image contributes to an experience. And what the author means by saying that is, he says that asking what images do when they are put to use. So, for example, if a person is looking at, let's say, the famous painting by Da Vinci, Mona Lisa, what exactly happens during the process where the person infers that it is a beautiful painting? What exactly is the mechanism there? How exactly is that image contributing to the feeling or to the experience of beauty that the viewer feels towards that image, right? So the author is trying to say that the scholars, while studying the images, should also try to figure out what happens, what mechanism actually exactly goes on here. What is the intermediate mechanism which happens post the person has perceived this image, and has is now inferring that it is something beautiful, or it is a work of genius, right? That's what he says, that if scholars engage in this enterprise, like people who are studying this study visual culture, if they are engaged in this enterprise of studying visual practices, if they inquire what exactly makes an image beautiful, or why this image or that constitutes a masterpiece or a work of genius, they should do so with the purpose of investigating an artist's or a work's contribution. They should do so with the purpose of investigating an artist's or the work's or the image's contribution to the experience of contribution to the experience of beauty, taste, value, or genius, right? Right? What exactly is the mechanism via which this image is contributing to the experience of beauty, genius, or masterpiece, beauty, genius, taste, value, etc. Right? So that's what he's trying to say. He's basically trying to have the scholar focus on the intermediate mechanism, on the practice here. Okay, let's start talk about the next part now. Now, in the next sentence, he says that no amount of social analysis can account fully for the existence of Michelangelo or Leonardo. They were unique creators of images that changed the way their contemporaries thought and felt and have continued to shape the history of art, artists, museums, feeling, and aesthetic value. Now, guys, this excerpt here, this part here, this sentence here, might in fact these two sentences might seem like they don't, on the face of it, they don't seem to belong to the topic, right? Like not directly at least. Because what the author has exactly tried to do here in these two sentences is he's tried to provide a potential counter argument to the argument that he just made in the first part of the paragraph. Okay, and to understand this counter argument, let's first look at the earlier part in slightly more depth. So when the author said that uh, while as a scholar who's engaged in the enterprise of scrutinizing visual practices, when he scrutinizes visual practices to figure out how the image actually contributes to beauty. Now, that idea that it's not just the image, but also the mechanism, also the visual practice that contributes to the perception of beauty, right? Basically shows or demonstrates that there are two factors involved. There are basically two factors involved when it comes to the perception of beauty or a masterpiece. There are basically two factors involved for this. The first factor is the image itself, and the second factor is the mechanism which helps the user infer that it's a beautiful painting, right? And in light of this idea, there could be a counter argument that, well, uh, there were painters and there were sculptors like Michelangelo and artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo who probably like are you trying to say that even in case of Michelangelo, like people sculptors and artists as great as Michelangelo and Leonardo, the visual practices or the outer aspect, the second factor, probably had a stronger role to play in demonstrating that their works were masterpieces than the first factor. Okay, so that's the counter argument. That can be a counter argument that, okay, if you're saying that there are two factors involved when it comes to the perception of beauty or perceiving an artwork as a masterpiece, the first being the work, the artwork or the painting itself, and the second being the mechanism by which the viewer perceives it to be a masterpiece, then in that case, are you saying that in case of Michelangelo and Leonardo, the second factor was probably more prominent, or maybe are you trying to attribute lesser value to their work themselves and maybe more value to the social aspect of perceiving those images to the mechanism of perceiving those images to be beautiful? Is that the case? That's the potential counter argument that the author has considered here. Okay, now let's read, in light of this explanation, now let's read this second sentence. He says that he preemptively counters that counter argument. He says that no amount of social analysis, like no amount of social analysis with respect to the mechanism here, can account fully, completely for the existence of Michelangelo and Leonardo, for the existence of the kind of masterpieces that these people created. No amount of social analysis and focus on this mechanism can demonstrate the level of beauty and genius that these artists were able to demonstrate in their works, right? They were unique creators of images. They were unique creators of images that changed the way that their contemporaries thought and felt and have continued to shape the history of art, artists, museums, feelings, and aesthetic values. So he's saying that, okay, no amount of like as much as we might want to attribute significance to the attention that should be paid to the visual practices as well, but still no amount of attention paid to this part can discard or can discount the value that should be attributed to artists such as great artists as great as Michelangelo and Da Vinci. Okay, and because they were unique creators of images, the fact that their images, their artworks were masterpiece are heavily dependent on their masterpiece, on the first factor, that the that the images were unique and they have then in a way they have changed the way their contemporaries thought and felt and have continued to shape the history of art, artists and museums. Okay, but and then what he does is he basically he acknowledges this counterpoint and then addresses this point in the favor of his earlier position. His earlier position was that you should focus at least as much attention to the mechanism and to the visual practice itself than the image. Okay, and then he says that, but granted that in case of these great artists, the image, the first factor was probably more prominent. Granted that, but still, the study of critical, artistic, and popular reception of works. Now, reception of works again relates to the mechanism here, how the viewer is receiving the works. By such artists as Michelangelo and Leonardo, that even in their case, the study of this process can shed important light on the meaning of these artists uh, and their works for many different people. Okay, it can further help us understand the meaning of their work, and of these the meaning that these artists wanted to convey, and and the meaning that they conveyed through their work for many different people. It can help us better understand that. And the history of meaning making has a great deal to do with how scholars as well as lay audiences and the whole history of meaning making is basically how the viewers perceive and how the viewers make sense of the find the artwork meaningful and thus a masterpiece or beautiful, right? So, and the whole history of meaning making has a great deal to do with how scholars as well as lay audiences, all types of viewers basically, understand these artists and their achievements, So, a fairly complex idea, but guys, see, at the end of it, all he has tried to do in this part of the passages lay emphasis on the importance of attending to the visual practices as much as a scholar might attend to the images themselves. Okay, the rest of that is just he has essentially just considered a counter argument and then and has just then acknowledged that and again made a point in favor of his own argument. Right, so that's all he has done. Let's move on to the next paragraph. Okay, coming to the next paragraph. The author says third is that means he means the third concern relating to the study of visual culture. Scholars studying visual culture might properly focus their interpretive work on life worlds by examining images, practices, visual technologies, taste, and artistic style as constitutive of social relations. The task is to understand how artifacts such as these, contribute to the construction of a world. Important methodological implications follow. Ethnography and reception studies become productive forms of gathering information, since these move beyond the image as a closed and fixed meaning event. Okay, now again, seems like a very complex idea, but let's understand this. So guys, see, the author, the first concern related to the study of visual culture, he said that the scholar should focus on all types of images. In the second concern, he said that they should also focus on the visual practices. And in the third concern, the point he's trying to make here is that the scholar should also focus on the social and cultural context of the viewer of the image. Okay, which is made up of and the social and cultural world, the context of the viewer is made up of artifacts such as images, visual technologies, taste, artistic style, etc. Okay, and that's what he says, that scholars studying visual culture might properly focus their interpretive work on life worlds by examining these artifacts that are constitutive of social relations, that basically make up their cultural and social context, and basically the task for the scholars is to understand how these artifacts contribute to the construction of their context of their world. Okay, and then because see guys, it's easy for us to relate and even for us to relate and understand that the it's not just the image that is responsible for how the viewer interprets it. It's also the context in which the viewer views the image or the artwork or the painting, that has a bearing on how it might be received by the viewer, right? So the context definitely matters. And in this case, the author is talking is emphasizing that the scholar should also focus on how the context of the viewer is made up from these kind of artifacts, and which may have a bearing on how the artwork might be received by the uh, viewers. Okay. Uh, there are also he also says okay, let's again reading the first sentence again. Says scholars studying visual culture might properly focus their interpretive work on life worlds probably relates to again the cultural context here, but we're not sure of that, and we don't need to be sure of that because it's just some word from this particular niche, from the niche from which this passage has been taken. Okay. Terms like life worlds and again there's the reception studies, these are not terms that well, if you already knew the meaning of these, it will definitely benefit you to get a more in-depth understanding, but it will not have marginal utility in terms of answering the questions. Okay, like you don't necessarily require, as you'll observe when we solve the questions, you don't require to know the in-depth meaning of each of these terms to understand the passage to a level to which you are required to understand it to answer the questions properly. Okay, with complete accuracy. So anyhow, we're not focusing on that. We're focusing on the main idea. The idea is that the author wants the scholars to study the visual culture and also examine the artifacts which make up the cultural and social context. Okay, and he says that this idea has important methodological implications in terms of the forms of gathering information. Okay, like ethnography being one form of gathering information and reception studies being another form of gathering information. Ethnography, guys, is basically the description of peoples and cultures with their customs, habits, and mutual differences. It's basically where uh, you consider people from different cultures to have to be following different practices, different customs, and different habits, right? That's what ethnic relates to culture, race, and ethnography is a record of that, description of that. So again, see, he says that if we are going to pay attention also to the context of the viewer, to the cultural context of the viewer, it has implications in terms of making ethnographical forms of gathering information to be more important, to be more productive. Because now, if you also gather information in terms of the culture of the viewer, it will provide more value because now we'll be able to better understand how the viewer, in what context the viewer has been viewing the artwork, okay, and how what implication that has on his interpretation of the image, right? So that's what he's saying, that important methodological implications follow from this idea, which are that ethnography and reception studies become productive forms of gathering information. Now, reception studies is another arcane term for those who are not from this niche, and most of us are not, I guess. So, reception studies is basically the application of literary theories of text interpretation of on part of a reader to to interpretation by masses, like so literary, what do we mean by literary theories of text interpretation? Now, literary theories of text interpretation are basically where theories which talk about how a reader might or might not interpret a certain text. That is a literary theory of interpretation. Now, reception studies is those theories applied not to a large number of people or in a larger context. That's the general description, okay, not the contextual, but the general description of meaning of this expression. Again, as I said, that's not important for us for us to know. I'm just telling you on the meaning of this expression on the sideline, on a side note. Okay. Anyhow, so in the paragraph, he says that it's important for scholars to focus on the context, on how this cultural context is made up of from these artifacts, and this idea that it is important that this idea that these artifacts and the cultural context is important also has implications in terms of making these forms of gathering information, ethnography such as ethnography and reception studies, to be quite important, because then you move beyond considering the image as a closed and fixed meaning event, because now the meaning of the image is not just constrained within the image, it also depends on the context, right? So it is not put in a closed and fixed meaning environment now. So that's the meaning of this paragraph. Let's move on to the next one. So in this paragraph, guys, the author has talked about the fourth and fifth concern related to the study of visual culture. He says that fourth, scholars may learn a great deal when they scrutinize the constituents of vision, that is the structures of perception as a physiological process, as well as the epistemological frameworks informing a system of visual representation. Vision, he says, is a socially and a biologically constructed operation depending on the design of the human body and how it engages with the interpretive devices developed by a culture in order to see intelligibly. Seeing operates on the foundation of covenants with images that establish the conditions for meaningful visual experience. Finally, the scholar of visual culture seeks to regard images as evidence for explanation, not as epiphenomena. That's your reading of the last paragraph, and let's try to understand what the author has said here. So, guys, after having focused on first all types of images, the visual practices, the cultural context, he finally the author has come to the discussion of the constituents of vision. Okay, and he has considered two types of constituents. The first is the biological type, very related to the physiological operations and the processes, right? Your eyes and the biological processes that are part of the whole mechanism of a person viewing an object or an artwork. And the second is the epistemological constituent, right? He says that, let's read the sentence. He says that scrutinize the constituents, that is the parts. Constituents means parts of vision, that is the structures of perception as a physiological process, the biological component, that is physiological component, as well as the epistemological framework. Now epistemology is basically the study of knowledge, anything that relates to the study of knowledge and information. So epistemological framework is a framework that helps you make sense of or derive information out of certain input. Okay, that's an epistemological framework. So he says one constituent of the vision or structure of perception can be a set of physiological processes, and the other could be the epistemological frameworks which help you which inform a system of visual representation. Inform means which help generate a system of visual representation, right? So these are the constituents, these two are the constituents of your structures of perception or the constituents of vision per se, right? The first one is a biological and physiological category. The second one is the social, I think you said social, right? Cultural, yeah, social or epistemological category. He further says vision is a socially, so he's talking about the second constituent, and a biologically constructed operation. First constituent, biologically constructed operation. Vision is based on both of them, depending on the design of the human body. So again, the biological constituent he refers to, and then how it engages with the interpretive devices developed by a interpretive devices are, by the way, your epistemological frameworks. And how that the human body engages with the interpretive devices, this epistemological component again, developed by a culture in order to see intelligibly. Okay, and both of these together constitute a system of representation. He says. Uh, then he moves on to the talking to talk about seeing as a phenomena. He says seeing operates on the foundation of covenants with images that covenants, when he talks about covenants, guys, he's referring to this system of visual representation, right? These covenants, these components, when the foundation of these covenants uh, with images, when these covenants come together, right? The images are always viewed via like like you have the biological and the physiological processes running, and you view the images in the via epistemological frameworks, right? Uh, when the images are viewed in tandem or along with in the on the foundation of these covenants, it makes up for a meaningful experience, meaningful visual experience. That's what he says in this this last sentence, second last sentence. Finally, he moves on to the fifth point. He says the fifth concern is that finally the scholar of visual culture seeks to regard images as evidence for explanation, not as epiphenomena. Now, epiphenomena is basically any part of a phenomena that is not directly or is not the main concern so far as that particular phenomena is concerned, is being talked about, right? So in this case, all the author is trying to say here is that the scholar of visual culture will regard images, will will attribute a primary status to images, will regard them to be primary and not would not associate a secondary significance to them, right? They would not consider it to be just a byproduct or a byproduct kind of a phenomena, right? It's just an epiphenomena. They'll regard it as provide put it on a primary pedestal. Okay, so that's your explanation of the last paragraph. So guys, see, if you note that although the ideas discussed are quite dense and the context is not at all relatable because the passage comes from a very niche domain. Still, you can still see the structure. He starts with two assertions, and then the rest of the passage is about the second assertion, and that's why you see this further coding here. And then he has listed each of these assertions one by one. First assertion was about all types of images, second about visual practices, third about the culture and social context, fourth one about the constituents of vision and structures of perception, where he talks about seeing and visual representation, and fifth one is about the primacy of your images, right? So with that, we come to the end of the passage explained. Coming to the central idea of the passage, it can be captured by the following short para. It says, visual culture is how images, the act of seeing, and their accompanying processes maintain or transform the world we live in. While the study of it means visual culture, relates to the analysis of these images and the many types of gazes. Concerns pertaining to the study of visual culture include examination of all types of images, visual practices, social or cultural contexts, constituents of vision, and attribution of a status of primacy to images. That, guys, would be the central idea of the passage. Okay, guys, so now for those of you who have not attempted the questions so far, you can do so by clicking on the link given in the description of uh, of the video, and it will take you to the link will take you to an interface where you can attempt the where you can read the passage as well as attempt the questions. And yeah, so that's about it so far as this video is concerned. Those of you who have not watched the intro video of the course, you can do so by clicking on the link here, and so do subscribe to the channel. I'll see you meanwhile in the next part where we discuss the questions of the passage. Okay.